What happens when a billionaire CEO goes undercover in his own company only to be ridiculed, insulted, and pushed to his breaking point by the very people he trusted? The twist? His response doesn't just leave them speechless, it changes their lives forever. This isn't just a story about humiliation, it's about redemption, transformation, and a lesson no one saw coming. Stay tuned, you won't believe how it all unfolds. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. Elliot Morgan leaned back in his leather chair, his gaze fixed on the sprawling skyline outside his office window. The city was alive with activity, its hum reaching even the insulated quiet of his penthouse office. Yet, for Elliot, the buzz of success he once felt was absent. His mind churned over the harsh words on the paper before him, a letter written by an employee, anonymous but piercingly honest. Words like toxic, overworked, and unseen jumped off the page, searing into him with a mix of guilt and anger. This wasn't what he had built. This wasn't the legacy he wanted to leave behind. You've been ignoring this for too long, Elliot. Maya, his younger sister and closest confidant, stood in front of his desk, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her voice carried a sharp edge of frustration that barely masked the concern beneath. This is just one letter. Do you know how many complaints HR buries before they even reach us? How long can you keep your head buried in reports while the people down there are struggling? Elliot didn't respond immediately. He folded the letter neatly and placed it on his desk, staring at it as though the paper itself might offer a solution. I didn't build this company to become the kind of place where people feel like this. And yet here we are, Maya replied, softening her tone. You've been so focused on expansion and the next big deal that you've lost sight of what's happening on the ground. These people feel invisible, Elliot. Her words cut deeper than she knew. He thought of his father, the man who'd spent decades working his way up in the industry, sacrificing so much to ensure Elliot and Maya never went without. The long nights, the exhaustion in his voice when he came home, and the pride in his eyes when Elliot graduated college. His father had taught him to value people, their effort, their stories, their struggles. And yet, here he was, a leader so far removed from his own workforce that he couldn't recognize their pain. Elliot sighed heavily and turned his chair back toward the window. Maybe you're right. I am right, Maya said, stepping closer. But words aren't enough. You need to act. Do something drastic. Make them see you care, understand what they're going through. He tilted his head slightly, catching her reflection in the glass. What are you suggesting? Her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Go down there. Disguise yourself. Work alongside them. Elliot blinked, startled by the idea. You're serious? As serious as that letter in front of you, she said. Go undercover. See for yourself what's happening. You've always trusted your instincts. It's time to put them to the test. For a moment, Elliot said nothing, the weight of her suggestion settling over him. The idea was outrageous. He'd be walking into the lion's den, exposing himself to criticism, embarrassment, maybe even failure. But something about it felt right. He had spent years leading from behind closed doors. It was time to step into the light, or rather, into the shadows, where his employees lived and toiled. The decision crystallized in his mind as he looked back at Maya. I'll do it. Her eyes widened slightly, surprised he had agreed so quickly. You will? He nodded, determination hardening his features. But if I do this, it has to be real. No special treatment, no shortcuts. I want to experience everything they do. Only then will I understand. Maya smiled, pride flickering in her eyes. That's the Elliot I know. The next morning, Elliot stepped into the mirror of his walk-in closet, staring at his reflection as if trying to see past the polished, composed image he had cultivated over the years. The suit and tie were gone, replaced by a pair of worn jeans, a plain t-shirt, and a second-hand jacket. His hair, usually slicked back, now fell loosely across his forehead, and he'd even grown out light stubble to complete the look. He barely recognized himself, which he supposed was the point. He grabbed a beat-up duffel bag, his only luggage for the journey ahead, and walked to the front door of his penthouse. Maya stood there, her brow furrowed with both encouragement and concern. "Be careful," she said. "They're not going to go easy on you." "I'm not asking them to," Elliot replied with a faint smile. "This isn't supposed to be easy." As he stepped into the elevator, leaving the world of privilege behind, Elliot couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. He didn't know what awaited him on the other side, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't come out of this experience the same. The first day at the company felt foreign, even though Elliot had built every corner of it. He stood outside the building's back entrance, clutching his weathered duffel bag. The bustling energy of employees arriving for their shifts surrounded him, cars pulling in, hurried footsteps on pavement, the muted hum of chatter. No one paid him much attention, which was both comforting and disconcerting. Stepping inside through the side door reserved for junior staff, Elliot was greeted by the faint smell of industrial cleaning supplies mixed with coffee. The break room was small and cramped, with mismatched chairs and a few faded motivational posters on the walls. A table in the center held a half-eaten box of donuts, its edges soaked with grease. Two employees sat at opposite ends, both scrolling on their phones, their expressions blank. Elliot hesitated, then approached the manager's desk at the far end of the room. A tall, sharp-featured woman with perfectly slicked hair barely glanced up from her laptop. Her badge read, "Olivia Patterson, floor manager." "You're late," she said, her tone flat but unmistakably disapproving. Elliot blinked. "Late?" "Orientation starts at 7 sharp," Olivia continued, finally meeting his gaze with a raised brow. "It's 7:08. We run a tight ship here. Tardiness doesn't fly." "I?" He stopped himself, biting back the instinct to explain or justify. Instead, he simply nodded. "It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't." She handed him a clipboard without looking up again. "Fill this out. Standard new hire paperwork. When you're done, Sophie will show you the ropes." Elliot took the clipboard and found an empty seat. The forms were simple enough: personal details, emergency contacts, tax information. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice Sophie, a petite woman with dark circles under her eyes, entering the break room with a weary shuffle. Her uniform was neatly pressed, but her frayed ponytail and faded sneakers told a different story. Sophie noticed Olivia gesturing toward Elliot and sighed audibly. "This the new guy?" "Try to keep him alive through his first shift," Olivia quipped dryly. "I don't want HR breathing down my neck." Sophie snorted, but there was no humor in it. "Sure, why not?" Elliot stood and extended a hand to Sophie. "Hi, I'm Eli." She gave his hand a quick shake but didn't meet his eyes. "Sophie, follow me." The tour was brisk and impersonal, with Sophie pointing out key areas of the workspace: the stockroom, the cramped office where Olivia held her meetings, the break room rules plastered on the walls. It was a hive of activity, with employees darting around, balancing trays or hauling equipment. Everywhere Elliot looked, there were furrowed brows and quick movements. No one lingered. No one smiled. The energy was sharp and transactional, a far cry from the idealistic vision he had once dreamed of for his company. Sophie stopped abruptly near the storage shelves. "Here's where we keep the cleaning supplies. You're on janitorial today. Mops, buckets, disinfectant, basic stuff. You think you can handle that?" "Of course," Elliot said, keeping his tone neutral. "Great." Sophie crossed her arms, studying him for the first time. "Look, I don't know who you ticked off to land on this crew, but here's the deal. Stay out of everyone's way, do what you're told, and maybe, just maybe, you won't get chewed out by Jake." "Jake?" Elliot asked, genuinely curious. Her expression darkened. "You'll meet him soon enough." Moments later, Elliot found himself scrubbing the floor near the main dining area, the faint chatter of customers filtering in through the swinging doors. The work was repetitive, but it gave him time to observe. Sophie moved quickly between tables, her forced smile fading the moment she turned away from customers. Across the room, Jake, a broad-shouldered man with a perpetual scowl, was barking orders at a younger employee, his voice carrying across the space. "You call this clean? What are you blind? Do it again." The younger worker mumbled an apology and bent over his task, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Jake turned away, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Elliot. A grin spread across his face, not friendly, but predatory. Well, well, new guy's finally doing something useful. Jake sauntered over, leaning on his mop handle. "You missed a spot, rookie, right there." He pointed to a random patch of floor. Elliot looked at the already clean area and considered his response. Swallowing his pride, he nodded. "Got it?" Jake chuckled and clapped him on the shoulder, harder than necessary. "Good boy. Maybe you'll last longer than the last idiot we had in here." Sophie shot Jake a sharp look from across the room, but said nothing. Elliot returned to his task, his jaw tight. He was beginning to understand just how deep the cracks ran in this place, and how much work it would take to fix them. As the day wore on, Elliot's shoulders ached, his back stiff from bending over to scrub stubborn stains. But it wasn't the physical exhaustion that weighed on him most. It was the sense of invisibility. The employees passed him without a glance, their conversations filled with complaints and frustration. They didn't see him as a person, just another cog in the machine. By the end of the shift, as Elliot washed his hands in the break room sink, he overheard Jake laughing with another employee nearby. "You see the way he jumps when I tell him what to do? Guy's like a scared little puppy." The words stung more than Elliot expected. He dried his hands and turned away, the echoes of Jake's laughter following him out the door. Elliot arrived the next morning earlier than anyone else, determined not to give Olivia any reason to fault him. The break room was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights humming faintly in the emptiness. He sat down at one of the mismatched chairs and glanced at the schedule pinned to the corkboard. His name was scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting beneath "General Cleaning." He sighed and leaned back, closing his eyes briefly to collect himself. The quiet didn't last long. The door swung open, and Sophie walked in, a paper cup of coffee in her hand and exhaustion etched into her face. She stopped short when she saw him sitting there. "You're early," she remarked, her tone neutral but tinged with surprise. "Figured I'd make a better impression today," Elliot replied with a small smile. She raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. Instead, she moved to the counter, setting her coffee down as she started rummaging through a drawer. "Hope you're ready for another day of Jake's nonsense." "Seems like he enjoys it," Elliot said, keeping his voice light, though the memory of Jake's mocking tone still lingered in his mind. Sophie snorted softly. "Yeah, well, Jake thinks he's king of the castle because Olivia lets him get away with it. She's too busy kissing up to corporate to deal with him." She glanced over her shoulder at Elliot. "Don't take it personally. He's like that with everyone." "Everyone?" Elliot asked, curious. "Pretty much," Sophie replied, turning back to her task. "But especially new hires, your fresh meat. He'll ease up eventually, maybe." Elliot decided not to press further. Instead, he focused on observing Sophie. There was a weariness about her that went beyond physical exhaustion. Her movements were efficient but robotic, as though she were running on autopilot. She sipped her coffee, her gaze distant, and for a moment, Elliot wondered what her life looked like outside of this place. What kept her up at night? What brought her here every day, despite the clear toll it was taking? The door opened again and the room instantly felt heavier. Jake strolled in, his swagger as pronounced as ever. His eyes landed on Elliot, and a slow smirk spread across his face. "Look who's eager to mop floors," Jake said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Don't get too comfortable, rookie. You've got the back bathrooms today." Elliot met his gaze evenly. "Got it." Jake chuckled, clearly disappointed by the lack of reaction. "We'll see how long that can-do attitude lasts." As Jake turned to leave, Sophie muttered under her breath, just loud enough for Elliot to hear, "Ignore him. It's the only way." Elliot nodded, appreciating the advice, but Jake wasn't the only thing weighing on him. The more time he spent here, the more he saw how deeply ingrained the problems were. Olivia's indifference, Jake's bullying, the sheer fatigue etched into the faces of people like Sophie. This wasn't a matter of tweaking policies or hosting morale-boosting workshops. It was systemic, rooted in the culture of the workplace itself. And it was his responsibility. The day dragged on much like the one before, but Elliot's observations deepened. He saw how Jake's domineering behavior created a ripple effect, spreading unease and frustration among the staff. He noticed how Olivia's hands-off approach left the team feeling unsupported. And he caught glimpses of the small acts of kindness that often went unnoticed. Sophie covering for a colleague who was running late. Connor quietly fixing a broken piece of equipment without being asked. By the time lunch rolled around, Elliot found himself sitting alone in the corner of the break room, picking at a pre-packaged sandwich. He watched as Sophie sat down with Connor at a nearby table, the two of them talking in low voices. From the snippets of conversation he overheard, he pieced together that Connor was struggling with his hours being cut. "They told me it's just temporary," Connor said, his voice tight with frustration. "But I can't afford temporary. My rent's due next week." Sophie frowned, her brow furrowed. "Have you talked to Olivia?" Connor let out a bitter laugh. "What's the point? She won't do anything." The conversation struck a chord with Elliot. He had known, intellectually, that many of his employees lived paycheck to paycheck, but hearing it laid out so plainly made it hit differently. He thought of the massive bonuses he had signed off on for executives last quarter and felt a sharp pang of guilt. After lunch, Elliot was assigned to clean the loading dock, a grimy, dimly lit area that smelled of oil and mildew. As he worked, he caught sight of Sophie hauling a heavy box across the space, her steps faltering under the weight. Instinctively, he stepped forward. "Let me help you with that," he said, reaching for the box. She hesitated, then handed it over with a small sigh of relief. "Thanks." "No problem," Elliot said, setting the box down where she indicated. "You shouldn't have to lift things like this on your own." Sophie shrugged. "It's part of the job." "It shouldn't be," Elliot said quietly, more to himself than to her. She gave him a curious look but didn't press. "Well, thanks anyway." As she walked away, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that he had just glimpsed a deeper truth about her, a resilience born of necessity, not choice. He had a growing urge to do something, to intervene, but he knew he couldn't reveal himself yet. Not until he fully understood what needed to change. The day ended with another round of sarcastic remarks from Jake, but this time Elliot barely noticed. His focus was elsewhere, his mind racing with plans and questions. How had it gotten this bad without him noticing? And more importantly, what was he going to do about it? As he walked out of the building that evening, the sky painted with hues of orange and purple, Elliot felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. This wasn't just about fixing a company. It was about fixing himself. The third day began like the others, but something had shifted in Elliot. The observations he had quietly collected over the past 2 days were building into a clearer picture, one that painted a workplace teetering on the edge of dysfunction. He arrived even earlier than before, determined to dig deeper, to peel back the layers of the people around him and the roles they played in this broken system. The break room was empty when he arrived, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Elliot took a seat in the far corner, not because he wanted to isolate himself, but because it gave him a vantage point. When the others started trickling in, he wanted to watch, to listen, to pick up on the unspoken dynamics that revealed more than words ever could. Sophie was the first to arrive, her usual weary demeanor softened slightly by a rare smile. She carried a small plastic container, and as she set it on the table, Elliot caught a glimpse of what looked like homemade cookies. A moment later, Connor entered, his expression brightening as Sophie pushed the container toward him. "I made these for you," she said, her voice quiet but warm. "I know things have been rough lately. Thought you could use a little pick-me-up." Connor's face lit up, and for the first time, Elliot saw him smile, a real, unguarded smile. "Thanks, Sophie. Seriously." Elliot watched the exchange, struck by how small acts of kindness like this seemed to be the glue holding everything together. Sophie, for all her exhaustion, had a quiet strength that inspired loyalty and camaraderie among the staff. It was a quality Elliot hadn't noticed on the surface, but now it was impossible to ignore. The moment was interrupted by Jake's entrance. His heavy footsteps and booming voice shattered the calm like a storm rolling in. "Cookies," Jake scoffed, eyeing the container on the table. "What is this, a bake sale?" Connor's smile vanished as he quickly slid the container closer to himself. "They're not for you, Jake." Jake leaned in, his grin widening. "Relax, I'm just messing with you." He grabbed one anyway, taking a big bite, before tossing the rest back onto the table. "Not bad." Sophie's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Elliot could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides. He wanted to step in, to say something, but he reminded himself that this wasn't the time. Not yet. The rest of the day unfolded much the same as the previous ones: grueling tasks, sharp words from Jake, and Olivia's disinterested presence hovering in the background. But Elliot began to notice cracks in Jake's facade. For all his bluster and bravado, there was something brittle about him, a sharpness that seemed more defensive than truly malicious. It wasn't until late in the afternoon, when Elliot overheard a heated conversation between Jake and Olivia, that the pieces began to fall into place. "Look, I'm doing my job," Jake snapped, his voice low but angry. "If you don't like how I'm handling things, maybe you should actually show up once in a while and manage." Olivia's voice was cold and clipped. "Watch your tone, Jake. You're not irreplaceable." Jake laughed bitterly. "Neither are you." Elliot lingered near the edge of the stockroom, out of sight, but close enough to hear. The tension between them was palpable, the kind that hinted at a long history of unresolved conflict. As Olivia walked away, Jake slammed a clipboard down onto a nearby counter, muttering something under his breath. Later that evening, as Elliot was finishing up his shift, he found Sophie sitting alone in the break room. She was staring down at her phone, a frown tugging at her lips. He hesitated before approaching, unsure if she wanted company, but she glanced up and gave him a small nod. "Long day?" he asked, sitting across from her. "Is there any other kind?" she replied with a wry smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elliot wanted to ask her about the cookies, about why she put so much effort into making others feel seen when she herself seemed invisible. But before he could find the words, Sophie broke the silence. "You know," she began, her voice soft, "when I started here, I thought it was temporary, just something to get me by until I found something better." She let out a bitter laugh. "That was 4 years ago." Elliot frowned. "Why did you stay?" Sophie shrugged. "Life happened. My daughter got sick, and the bills piled up. Then the pandemic hit, and this place, it was the only thing keeping us afloat." Her voice cracked slightly, and she looked away. "It's not perfect. God, it's not even good most days. But it's a paycheck, and right now, that's all I can afford to care about." Elliot felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't expected her to open up like this, and the raw honesty in her words left him shaken. He thought about all the times he had glanced at profit margins and revenue reports without considering the people behind the numbers, People like Sophie, who were barely holding on. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and though the words felt inadequate, he meant them. Sophie looked at him, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, it seemed like she might ask him something, but she simply shook her head. "Don't be. It's just how it is." As she stood to leave, Elliot's resolve hardened. He wasn't just here to observe anymore. He was here to make things right. And as he watched Sophie walk out of the room, he knew one thing for certain. The time for silence was over. The morning air was heavy with anticipation as Elliot entered the building again, this time with a renewed sense of purpose. He'd spent most of the night replaying Sophie's words in his head, her story cutting through the comfortable illusion he had built for himself as a leader. He wasn't here to fix surface-level problems anymore. He was here to dismantle the entire system of neglect that had taken root in his company, and he knew that started by understanding every crack in its foundation. The tension on the floor felt thicker today, the weight of unspoken frustrations hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Elliot noticed it in the sharpness of Jake's commands, the slump of Sophie's shoulders, and the clipped conversations Olivia exchanged with the staff. Something was brewing. Mid-morning, Elliot was tasked with cleaning the dining area, while the team prepared for a corporate inspection scheduled for later that afternoon. The employees worked faster than usual, their movements edged with nervous energy. Olivia prowled the floor, barking orders and adjusting table placements with an obsessive precision. "Everything needs to be spotless," she said, her voice rising above the ambient noise. "Corporate doesn't tolerate mediocrity." As Elliot scrubbed a stubborn stain from one of the tiles, he overheard Jake muttering under his breath to another employee. "Corporate doesn't tolerate mediocrity? Look at this place. The whole system's mediocre." Elliot glanced at Jake, noting the rare moment of honesty in his tone. He was beginning to see a pattern with Jake, a man who lashed out at others because it was easier than confronting his own frustrations. For all his bravado, Jake was just as trapped as the rest of them. By lunchtime, the tension had reached a boiling point. Olivia had criticized nearly everyone on the floor, her frustration with the impending inspection spilling over into harsh reprimands. Jake, already seething from her earlier comments, finally snapped. "You know what, Olivia?" he said, slamming down a tray he had been carrying. "Why don't you stop pretending you care about this place? We all know you're just trying to look good for corporate." The room fell silent. Everyone froze, their eyes darting between Jake and Olivia. Even Sophie, who had been quietly arranging cutlery, stopped mid-motion. Olivia's face flushed with anger. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Jake said, his voice louder now. "You walk around here, acting like you're in charge, but the truth is, you're just as checked out as the people upstairs. You don't care about us. You don't even care about this place." "Watch your tone, Jake," Olivia said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You're out of line." "And you're out of touch," Jake shot back. "We're the ones who keep this place running, and all we get is scraps while you kiss up to the suits." Elliot watched the exchange, torn between stepping in and staying silent. His instinct as a leader screamed at him to intervene, but he knew this moment wasn't about him. It was about the raw, unfiltered truth spilling out of Jake, a truth that, deep down, everyone in the room felt. The tension was broken when Sophie spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "Jake, that's enough." Jake turned to her, his anger flickering. "Don't tell me you don't feel the same, Sophie. You've been here longer than any of us. You know I'm right." Sophie hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "You're not wrong," she admitted quietly, "but this isn't the way to fix it." Her words hung in the air, a delicate balance between agreement and reproach. Jake let out a bitter laugh and threw his hands up in frustration. "There's no fixing this place, Sophie, not as long as they see us as numbers instead of people." With that, he stormed out of the room, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Olivia, clearly rattled, straightened her posture and addressed the room. "Everyone, back to work. Now." Slowly the staff dispersed, but the energy had shifted. The cracks in the system, once hidden beneath layers of routine and silence, were now fully exposed. Elliot could feel it in the way people moved, the way they avoided eye contact with Olivia, the way Sophie's shoulders sagged even more than usual. As the afternoon wore on, Elliot found himself assigned to the back kitchen with Sophie. The task was monotonous, scrubbing trays and loading dish racks, but the silence between them was anything but. Finally, Sophie broke it. "You heard what Jake said," she began, her voice barely audible over the hum of the dishwasher. "Do you think he's right?" Elliot hesitated, carefully considering his response. "I think he's speaking from a place of frustration. But that doesn't mean the system can't be fixed." Sophie looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You really think so? Because I've been here long enough to know that promises don't mean much." "It's not about promises," Elliot said, his voice steady. "It's about action, and it's about people like you who make this place better, even when the system makes it hard." Sophie blinked, clearly caught off guard by his words. For a moment she seemed like she wanted to say something, but instead she nodded and returned to her task. The corporate inspection came and went without incident, but the day's events lingered in everyone's minds. As Elliot walked out of the building that evening, the weight of what he had witnessed pressed down on him. The anger, the exhaustion, the fleeting moments of hope. They were all pieces of a puzzle he was still trying to solve. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Change wasn't just needed, it was inevitable. And it was up to him to make it happen. The next day dawned with an unusual sense of urgency for Elliot. The tension from the previous day had left an imprint on everyone, and he could feel it the moment he stepped into the building. Conversations were muted, glances were wary, and the air carried the weight of unspoken grievances. The storm Jake had stirred had not subsided. It was merely simmering beneath the surface, waiting for another spark. Elliot went straight to the stockroom to begin his tasks, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of Jake's outburst, Sophie's quiet resignation, and Olivia's cold attempts to maintain order. It wasn't enough to observe anymore. He needed to act, even if it was in small, subtle ways that wouldn't betray his identity just yet. Midway through the morning, Sophie found him stacking boxes near the back dock. Her usual weariness was replaced by a guarded expression, and she seemed hesitant to speak. "Eli," she began, her tone unusually cautious, "I need to ask you something." Elliot straightened, brushing the dust off his hands. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was within earshot. "You're different from the others. You don't complain, you don't push back, you just listen. Why is that?" The question caught him off guard, but he maintained his composure. "I'm just here to learn," he said simply. "Sometimes it's better to listen than to speak." Sophie studied him for a moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. "It's rare, that's all. Most new hires don't last a week. You don't seem like someone who belongs here." Her words carried a quiet accusation, but also a hint of curiosity. Elliot felt the weight of her scrutiny and decided to deflect. "Maybe I just haven't had a reason to quit yet." Her lips twitched in what might have been a smile, but it faded quickly. "Well, if you do, no one would blame you." Before he could respond, Olivia's voice rang out from the front of the stockroom. "Sophie, Eli, I need you both in the dining area, now." The dining area was in chaos when they arrived. A tray of food had been spilled near one of the booths, and Jake stood at the center of it all, his face red with anger as he berated a younger employee. The young man, no older than 19, looked on the verge of tears as Jake's voice grew louder. "Do you even know how to carry a tray?" Jake snapped. "This isn't rocket science." "Jake," Sophie interrupted, stepping between them, "that's enough." Jake turned on her, his glare sharp. "Stay out of this, Sophie." "I said that's enough," she repeated, her voice firm. "It was an accident. Yelling at him isn't going to fix it." Jake looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Sophie's tone stopped him. He muttered something under his breath and stalked off, leaving Sophie and Elliot to clean up the mess. The younger employee mumbled an apology and hurried away, clearly shaken. As they worked, Elliot couldn't help but admire Sophie's composure. She had a quiet authority that commanded respect, even in the face of someone as volatile as Jake. It was a quality that reminded him of his father, strong, steady, and unwavering in the face of adversity. "You handled that well," he said, breaking the silence. Sophie shrugged, her expression guarded. "Someone had to. Jake doesn't know when to stop." "Why does he act like that?" Elliot asked, genuinely curious. "He's obviously frustrated, but there's more to it, isn't there?" Sophie hesitated, then sighed. "Jake's got his own baggage. He used to care about this place, believe it or not. He even got Employee of the Month a few years ago. But then corporate cut his hours, promised him a promotion that never came. He's angry, and he takes it out on everyone else." Elliot absorbed her words, feeling a pang of guilt. How many promises had been broken under his watch? How many employees like Jake had been left disillusioned because of decisions made in boardrooms far removed from the reality of the workplace? The rest of the day passed in a blur, but Elliot's mind was racing. He saw the interconnected web of struggles, frustrations, and betrayals that had brought the staff to this breaking point. Jake wasn't just a bully, he was a symptom of a larger problem. Sophie wasn't just a survivor, she was a leader who had been overlooked. Olivia wasn't just cold, she was navigating her own pressures from the top. That evening, Elliot stayed late, long after the others had gone home. He walked through the now empty dining area, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. He thought of his father, of the lessons he had tried to pass down, and how far Elliot had strayed from them. This wasn't what his company was supposed to be. It wasn't what he was supposed to be. As he stood in the center of the room, staring at the rows of empty tables, a plan began to take shape. It wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't be quick, but it was necessary. The time for observation was over. It was time to start making changes, not as Elliot Morgan, the CEO, but as Eli Matthews, the man who had seen the cracks firsthand. And when the moment was right, he would reveal the truth. But not yet. There was still work to be done. The morning of Elliot's final day undercover arrived with a heavy sense of anticipation. He had spent the last week observing, enduring, and piecing together the lives and struggles of his employees. He'd learned their names, their fears, and their dreams. He'd watched how they weathered challenges and leaned on one another when things got too hard. But today, everything would change. Today, they would finally learn who he was. The break room was buzzing with nervous energy. A company-wide meeting had been announced the previous evening, an event that rarely happened without corporate higher-ups involved. Employees whispered in hushed tones, speculating about layoffs, restructuring, or some new policy that would inevitably make their lives harder. Elliot sat quietly in the corner, his heart pounding in his chest. He was dressed in the same worn jeans and jacket he had worn on his first day, but today they felt like a disguise he was about to shed. Sophie caught his eye as she entered the room, her usual weariness replaced by a flicker of curiosity. "Any idea what this meeting's about?" she asked, sitting across from him. Elliot shook his head, offering her a faint smile. "Not a clue." Before she could respond, Olivia's voice came over the intercom. "All staff, please report to the main dining area immediately." The employees shuffled into the dining area, filling the space with a mix of dread and impatience. Olivia stood near the front, her usual stoic demeanor betraying a hint of unease. Beside her stood a man in a sharp suit, one of the corporate executives who rarely made appearances on the floor. He glanced around the room with a practiced air of detachment, his hands clasped in front of him. Elliot stood near the back, blending into the crowd as Olivia began to speak. "Thank you all for gathering here today. I know there's been a lot of speculation about this meeting, so Let me get straight to the point." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. "This company has been undergoing some transitions. We've been working hard to evaluate our operations, our leadership, and most importantly, our culture. And in light of that, we have a special announcement to make." Elliot felt the weight of every eye in the room as Olivia stepped aside and gestured toward the man in the suit. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his tone polished but impersonal. "For those of you who don't know me, I'm Thomas Adler, the Chief Operations Officer. Over the past few weeks, we've been conducting a unique initiative to better understand the day-to-day experiences of our staff, and today, we'd like to share some of the findings." Thomas turned toward the back of the room, his gaze landing directly on Elliot. "Mr. Morgan, would you care to join us?" The room fell silent as heads turned, confusion rippling through the crowd. Elliot took a deep breath and stepped forward, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his shoulders. He could feel the disbelief and shock in every pair of eyes that followed him to the front of the room. As he reached the front, he turned to face the employees he had worked beside for the past week. Their expressions ranged from stunned to angry to curious, but all of them were waiting for him to explain. "Good morning," Elliot began, his voice steady despite the nerves clawing at him. "I know many of you are wondering what's going on, and I owe you all an explanation." He paused, scanning the crowd. He saw Sophie standing near the middle, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Jake was leaning against a wall, his jaw clenched, while Connor stood near the back, his face unreadable. "My name is Elliot Morgan," he continued, his voice carrying across the room. "I'm the founder and CEO of this company, and for the past week, I've been working here undercover as Eli Matthews." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room, but Elliot pressed on. "I didn't come here to spy on you or judge you. I came here because I needed to see firsthand what it's like to be one of you, to experience the challenges you face every day, the struggles you endure, and the ways this company has let you down." His voice faltered for a moment, but he pushed forward. "What I've seen over the past week has been both humbling and heartbreaking. I've seen the exhaustion in your eyes, the frustration in your voices, and the kindness you show each other despite everything. I've seen people like Sophie, who carry more on their shoulders than anyone should have to, and people like Jake, who are angry because they care deeply but feel unheard." Jake's head snapped up at the mention of his name, his expression softening just slightly. "I've also seen the cracks in this company, the cracks that I, as your leader, allowed to grow. And for that, I am deeply sorry." The room was silent now, the weight of Elliot's words settling over everyone. He took a deep breath and continued, "But I didn't come here just to apologize. I came here to make things right. Starting today, we will be implementing changes to ensure that this company becomes the place it was always meant to be, a place where every employee feels valued, supported, and respected." He outlined the changes: fairer pay, better benefits, stricter accountability for management, and a commitment to fostering a culture of respect and inclusion. He spoke with a sincerity that came not from his position as CEO, but from his experience as a man who had walked in their shoes. When he finished, he looked out at the crowd, his gaze landing on Sophie. "I know words aren't enough, and I know trust isn't rebuilt overnight, but I promise you, this is just the beginning." For a moment, the room was still. Then, slowly, Sophie stepped forward. She studied him with an intensity that made his chest tighten, and for a moment he feared she would turn away. But then she extended her hand. "Let's see if you mean it," she said simply. Elliot shook her hand, gratitude swelling in his chest. One by one, the other employees began to nod, murmur, and step forward, their guarded hope slowly replacing the skepticism in their eyes. As the crowd began to disperse, Elliot felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Jake standing there, his expression unreadable. "Don't mess this up," Jake said gruffly. before walking away. Elliot smiled faintly, the weight on his shoulders a little lighter now. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. And this time, he wouldn't walk it alone. Elliot stood in the break room one last time, no longer as Eli Matthews, but as the man who had rediscovered what it truly meant to lead. The journey had been humbling, witnessing the resilience of people like Sophie, the quiet strength they carried despite the challenges thrust upon them. He had seen pain, frustration, and anger, but also compassion, determination, and humanity. This wasn't just about a company anymore. It was about the people who built it day by day with their sweat and perseverance. As Elliot walked out of the building, a small framed photo in his hand, a gift from the staff showing the entire team smiling together, he realized the lesson he would carry with him. Leadership isn't about sitting at the top. It's about standing alongside those you lead, listening, learning, and making sure every voice is heard. It's about humility and action, not just power and profits. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were in Elliot's shoes? Together, let's celebrate stories that remind us of the importance of empathy, humility, and connection. Love.